Professional mountain biker Adam Craig says it's one of the top 3 places in the universe he's ridden. Where is this magical mountain biking nirvana? It's none other than Brevard, North Carolina, home to Pisgah National Forest and DuPont Recreational Forest. The area boasts over 300 miles of peerless single track, not to mention hundreds of miles of gravel roads, creating a near endless array of routes, terrains, and challenges to explore. 4 vibrant bike shops will get you sorted, whether you need gear, service, or a top-notch rental. Top it off with an array of craft breweries, cafes, and gathering spots that have earned Brevard the title as one of the best small towns in America in 2021. It all adds up to a premier mountain biking destination you'll want to experience for yourself. Find out more at explorebrevard.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks Podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest once again is Ben Turits. Ben runs a coaching business and sports therapy practice called the Endurance Collective. He's a former professional mountain bike racer and current USA cycling coach, working with both pro and amateur athletes alike. Thanks for joining us again, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. It's always good to be on the pod.
Yeah. Well, so when I was writing out this intro, I looked back at the one we used before, and this one's a little different. I actually am embarrassed to say this. I didn't realize you were a professional mountain bike racer. So you started out racing cross country from what I read, and you dabbled in mountain bike marathon as well. You recently competed in an enduro race. So how did that go?
Yeah. The enduro was awesome, man. I got my start in the mountain bike world in the early 90s as a downhill racer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Back when downhill bikes had rim brakes, and, I just thinking back to, my current cross country race bike is a much more capable bike than what I first raced downhill on.
Wow.
So
times have changed.
But yeah, enduro was fun, man. I mean, I would dare to say enduro is much like what we used to call mountain biking, just in general.
Yeah.
Just a fun time ripping down some challenging trails. And it was pretty humbling because all the people who were at the top of the field were all kind of either active or ex-downhillers.
Oh, interesting.
And so, yeah, they had a different skill set, a much more refined downhill brain than I did.
Yeah.
So I would say I still excelled at the flatter, wide open pedaling sections, and I'm terrified of road gaps.
Oh, jeez. Wow, there were road gaps in this.
Yeah, there was a road gap and like a small pond gap.
Whoa.
Which was I rode the beeline on both of those.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you mentioned how you started out in downhill. How does enduro today compare to downhill back then? It seems like maybe they'd be kind of similar, but I don't know.
Pretty similar, yeah. I mean, nothing like, I did some courses as like a junior where it was like wide open mammoth mountain style stuff where, you're just riding a fire road down at full speed.
Yeah.
So not that. It was 4 to 6 minutes of wide open, super technical at the top, and some jumpier, flowier stuff at the bottom. It was just fun mountain biking.
Yeah.
Really good scene too. I enjoyed being around the crowd there. We actually camped out.
Oh, cool.
There was a big bonfire and a party the night before, and it was like kind of like 1997 mountain bike racing.
Yeah.
With cooler, more capable bikes.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Was this the kind of race where it was like on site where you didn't get a chance to check out the course, or did you at least get to pre-ride parts of it?
So my buddy and I, we pre-rode 3 of the 4 stages. We were just so smoked from the uphill portions and some of the hike-a-bike sections that we neglected to pre-ride stage 2, which happened to be one of the faster, more wide open stages. So, it presented some surprises the next day, but we got a good pre-ride in, and, it was fun to check that stuff out, and definitely was beneficial to know where those gaps were.
Yeah. Well, so you're primarily a fitness coach, really, for cyclists. So I'm curious to know, did you do any like enduro specific fitness training ahead of time for the race?
I did. And I kind of spent some time figuring out what that was last year
Hmm.
because I've spent a lot more time on long travel bikes in the last really 2-3 years. And so a lot more time in the weight room,
Hmm.
which really, really helped. And we have a really good strength trainer here. And she kind of put a program together for one of my World Cup level athletes. And I have been following that program with some slight modifications, but a lot more instability work, some heavy lifting phases. And, those of you who do a lot of downhill oriented stuff know that quad burn you get when you're just hovering over your saddle for minutes at a time.
Yeah.
So trying to simulate that with front squats and deadlifts and stuff like that.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah.
It was very different from what I was used to as a beanpole cross country racer.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I learned and wish I had known when I was a 20-year-old pro mountain biker was, how important the strength training aspect was to the overall race.
Yeah.
We were always used to be so worried about getting big with strength training and ride so much. That's just not going to happen.
Right. What about the transition stages? Was that like an issue for you at all? Or were you surprised like how much like endurance you needed for that as well? Like aerobic endurance?
I was. Yeah, I was really surprised. And it was just a very steep kind of fire road to the start of every stage. And, just riding a almost 30-pound 6-inch travel bike uphill over and over again, it's not the easiest thing in the world. So there was, I'll say I got blisters on my heels from pushing a couple of times.
Right. You got to practice your hike a bike, I guess.
Exactly. Learning how to put my full face on the handlebars and wear my goggles around my neck.
Yeah. Yeah. Right on.
Yeah. I was definitely surprised at the transition part of it and how hard that was. That really wore me down.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine as like an endurance athlete, a lot of folks probably underestimate that part and figure like, oh, I don't even need to think about that. Like, but yeah, it plays into your descending too. I'm sure. Like if you wear yourself out on the climbs and like getting to the top of the stage, you're going to struggle when you're going down as well.
Oh, absolutely. And it was weird seeing guys on e-bikes come past us and they're just like, do. And we're like, oh man, come on. I gotta push this heavy thing up to the top of the stage and I'm going to lay down for 20 minutes before I can do the stage.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the topic at hand here today and talk about fitness metrics. Mm-hmm. So with the explosion of training apps and devices, it seems like riders today have access to a number of fitness metrics that I assume can potentially help us get in better shape. One of the numbers that people have been tracking for a while now is something called VO2 max. So tell us, what does that exactly measure for a person?
Yeah, so there is a ton of metrics out there, and VO2 max is kind of like the gold standard that we held people to forever. And it measures gas inhaled and exhaled. And what you can do is tell the power and heart rate ranges where you are aerobic and anaerobic, as well as kind of the maximum volume of oxygen you can move through your body.
Okay.
So theoretically, the higher the VO2 max, the more oxygen you can move through your system. Mm-hmm. And in theory, the more power you can produce.
Okay.
More power is better.
Right.
But there's a lot of caveats to that. And so I think one of the things that's important to talk about today is the context of these tests. And with VO2 max, one of the big things that I always, because people certainly ask, like, do I need to get a VO2 max test? Mm-hmm. And my kind of question to them is, well, what are you going to do with that information?
Right.
A VO2 max test is a lab test. So you have to go to a performance lab, put on the mask and do the test. And then you're going to get a series of numbers, those numbers aren't necessarily the first things that are going to help you get better. I would make the argument to an amateur athlete that there's a lot of things that come in front of getting a VO2 max test that are going to help you.
Okay.
So is your nutrition dialed in? Are you getting enough rest? Do you have a training plan that includes progression? And are you increasing the stimulus every week to try and force adaptation? And those simple things to start are going to be much more useful than something like VO2 max testing.
Okay.
And I was having this conversation with another coach the other day, and we were talking about testing metrics, and VO2 always comes up. And it's like, unless somebody, in my opinion, if somebody else is paying for you to get that testing, then that's meaningful. And you are at a level where those numbers can make a difference in the lab.
Okay.
So, the other thing about VO2 max testing now is there is software out there that can approximate it. Training Peaks and we as coaches, a lot of us use WKO, and you can approximate the values of your VO2 max. But it really is important to know that VO2 isn't the whole picture of you as an athlete. It really is essential that you contextualize these numbers and testing. And, there's so many other pieces of low hanging fruit before you get to VO2 max.
Yeah. So I guess like the lab test that you're talking about, that's the one we've probably seen like videos or like pictures of people like person on a treadmill and they've got like the mask on and they're breathing into it. And yeah, it looks kind of painful.
Yeah. It's no fun. It really is no fun.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're basically like exercising to exhaustion. And, but there are, like you said, there's other like approximations to get that number. I remember when I was in the military, they actually, as part of our fitness, like we had to do an annual fitness check-in to make sure that we were staying fit. And the story goes that they used to have people like run a mile or do something. This was the Air Force, so maybe other services were different, but they were finding that people, they didn't exercise all year or they weren't taking care of their bodies. And so they'd run a mile and they would just like collapse. And so they had to change the test. And somebody said, hey, like maybe we should just measure people's VO2 max. And so they had this test where you would go and sit on like a stationary bike and it'd hook you up to a heart rate monitor and you'd go through this series of like different resistance levels, or maybe it was different like cadence amounts.
They probably increased your resistance.
Yeah. And then they would give you a number. They'd say, yeah, this is your number. It's, you either pass or fail. And so, yeah, I've always been interested in that number and like how accurate it is as a fitness measurement. So like how important is that? Like as an athlete, if I line up, at the starting line and I've got a VO2 max of 50 and the guy beside me has a 60, like, is he just going to win because it's like, that's the number and he's capable of doing more, or is it more nuanced than that?
It's, there's so much more around it than that. There's just plain old fashioned hard work. Greg LeMond's, a good example. Like he had a high VO2 max number, but he also trained his butt off and, did all of the things around having that physiological advantage to be a good bike racer. So the guy who shows up with a higher VO2 max, if he's not on form, if he's tired, if he's fatigued, like if his time to exhaustion is shorter than your time to exhaustion with a 50 VO2 max, right. You can sustain a higher level effort for a longer period of time. So, that number in and of itself is, it's just simply not the whole picture. It's a snapshot of how much oxygen you can move through your body at a given time on a given day. But it doesn't take into account all the other variables of training that may give you, Jeff, with a 50 VO2 max, huge advantages over, rider X with a 60 VO2 max.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that something that changes day to day too? Like you're saying, like if, you line up on the day and you haven't rested enough, or like
No,
there's something going on with your diet, or you haven't recovered. Yeah. Is your VO2 max going to change day to day, or it's pretty constant?
no, it's pretty. I mean, it can be trained to some extent, but it's not like heart rate where it's immediately affected by all kinds of outside variables like fatigue or sickness or caffeine intake or something like that. It is a more static metric, but it is certainly not the end all be all. And it one of the reasons I, as a coach, discourage a lot of my athletes from getting VO2 max testing is, I ask them, like, is the intelligence you're going to get from this test actionable? Can we do anything with this number meaningful? And a lot of times, the answer realistically is no. Having an idea is fun, but if, the negative side of that, somebody coming back with a VO2 of 50 and they thought they were a 70, the negative side of that is much bigger than the positive side of it.
Right.
So often, I've heard like Hunter Allen talk about it. He's another coach out there that discourages his amateur athletes from getting VO2 max testing because the negative far outweighs the positive in terms of just the psychological impact of knowing that number.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, that brings up the question to me then, like, why do we care so much about it? Or why do you think athletes focus on it so much?
Because it's been this like Olympic level gold standard. And so many of us, and you see this in a lot of sports, so many of us aspire to be that pro level athlete and do all the things that the pro level athletes are doing. But you don't really need to do that unless you're a pro level athlete. I don't want my amateur mountain bike racers training 20 to 25 hours a week.
Right.
Like a UCI World Cup racer. It's just going to, crush their souls. If at some point they want to try and progress to that point, okay, there has to be a structured plan to get there. But there's so many steps along the way that are important before we start getting somebody in a lab and doing something like a VO2 max test. If you're a university kid and somebody's like, hey, I'm doing a physiology study, can I do a VO2 max test on you? Cool, do it. But I would advise against paying money to get VO2 max testing done, because what you're going to get out of that is much less important than, spending that money on putting together a really good strength training plan or speaking with a performance dietitian. There's so many better ways that will immediately impact your training in the short term and the long term than spending money on a lab test like that.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I kind of get how it is tempting to like focus on it and to really, because it's like a number and it's been sold as this thing that kind of boils down like your fitness. And, my Garmin app, it even has a thing that's like, you're in the top 10% for your age group, or you have the fitness age of a healthy 20-year-old or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you said too, like you can compare to a professional athlete. You can say, well, Lance Armstrong had a 92 VO2 max supposedly or whatever. So I think for a lot of us, it is tempting to focus on it, but it's good to know that it's just one metric that's possibly not even that important. I mean, it's definitely not the first thing that people need to focus on if your goal is truly being fit or like truly being competitive in racing.
Outside of professional level athletes, I would just say there's really not a need for it. It certainly is a valuable test as an elite athlete. There is intelligence that can be gained and actionable stuff you can do, but it requires more lab work. It requires pretty involved coaching and lots of time to train. Like what you're saying about numbers too is, like, yes, it's a number. It's similar to things like, FTP. Everybody talks about that number. And yes, FTP can be an important number in training, but it is a snapshot, and out of context, it doesn't mean much.
Right.
It's a number that becomes a tool to build your training off of rather than measure yourself against other athletes.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah. So, I mean, let's talk about other metrics. Another one that we've obviously heard about is the anaerobic or lactate threshold. So is that sort of the flip side to VO2 max, or is this measuring something very different?
So what you're doing with a lactate test is you're taking blood over like a 60-minute steady state effort, and you're trying to figure out when your body accumulates more acid than it can buffer.
Okay.
And so when that happens, you cross a physiological threshold, and you actually physically need to decrease your effort.
Okay.
You can no longer sustain that level of effort. So the higher your threshold is, theoretically, the harder and longer you can work. And that's what we're looking for. And that is something that you can train. And, there are ways outside of the lab. The lab is the gold standard. And there are several different protocols to getting that blood lactate test done. And I couldn't tell you them off the top of my head, but it is the gold standard for heart rate, monitoring heart rate and figuring out those thresholds in your body.
Yeah.
But there is a cheater way to do that, using power. And the great thing about power is, it's a very objective measure. We talk a lot about power versus heart rate, and heart rate is a good metric, but it is influenced by many external factors. And we kind of touched on, fatigue and sickness, or it could be heat dependent or dehydration. With power, you're producing 250 watts or you're not.
Right.
And as a coach, I'm going to use that heart rate data to dig further into why you may or may not have had a successful interval set. So we're using power to estimate our threshold.
Okay.
And I'm sure you've heard of the dreaded FTP test.
Yeah.
The 20-minute test, which, there's several tests that people use out there. Some coaches are mean enough to make their athletes just ride really hard for an hour.
Oof.
I'm actually a big fan of that for my more elite athletes, because there's a lot of variability in a 20-minute test for a downhiller is going to be very different from a 20-minute test for a marathon mountain bike racer. The marathon racer can probably produce a similar power at 1 hour than they can at 20 minutes, where a downhiller, that power might be much higher and drop off more precipitously because their anaerobic system is more trained, and their anaerobic system is contributing more in that first 20 minutes.
Right.
So, that's the FTP test is kind of right now one of the easy standards to estimate your lactate threshold or threshold power.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not super familiar with any of this, obviously, and you're the expert. So, like, when I think of lactate, I think of like that burning feeling that I get in my muscles. And when I think of that too, though, I feel like there's a mental component to pain, right? Especially where like some people are better than others at like, pushing through pain, or like going a little bit farther than somebody else who's like, nope, that's enough pain. I'm stopping. I'm slowing down, like whatever. So like, how does that play into your lactate threshold? Like, how do you know your limit versus like your mental limit?
Yeah. I mean, the mental governor, is it's your body is trying to protect itself and protect its reserve energy from being used up. So it's a very powerful feeling, and some people just aren't. They hit that point where everything hurts and they shut it down. And typically that person does not make a good marathon mountain bike racer.
Yeah.
They may be more suited to do shorter, like gravity style events, because you're going to burn, but you're going to burn for 2 to 5 minutes. And most people can sustain a little bit of discomfort for that period of time. I'd say as I've gotten older, my motivation to hurt past 60 minutes has decreased, and
Right.
I no longer feel the need to push my body's governor.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been some really interesting research out there, especially with athletes who compete in Race Across America,
Mm-hmm.
on pushing through that perceived physiological limit
Mm-hmm.
into your body's kind of fight or flight reserves. And it's probably a podcast for another time, but there's some interesting there's some interesting peer reviewed data out there about how much more your body has, and very few people can tap into those reserves.
Right.
Those are the top endurance athletes.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying too is that for elite athletes, like mentally, they're all kind of at the level where they're going to push through the pain, and like, it's not going to be a mental block. It's literally going to be their body, like, just unable to go any faster or any farther. But I would imagine for amateur athletes, part of it is mental. Part of it is saying, look, this is going to hurt, or like, this is hurts now. It can hurt more and you'll be okay. Like,
yeah. We have, we do a lot of coaching with ultra endurance runners here at our office.
Mm-hmm.
So two of our coaches are ultra marathoners, and there's right now is 100-mile running season, which, for me is just like absolutely crazy. But, I would never be able to do that. But gosh, it is such a mental game. And being able to, it's the same thing for marathon mountain bike races too, being able to keep your head in the game for 4 to 6 hours of moderate to high intensity riding. It's a challenge, and making sure that you have the presence of mind to do all the other things, like, make sure you're eating and drinking and using your lockout when you're climbing, and
mm-hmm.
dropping your seat post on descents. Like, those may seem like really simple things and no duh things, but man, when you've been riding for 4.5 hours at your limit, sometimes you forget to do stuff. Some really simple things like that.
Yeah.
Counter steering becomes a difficult thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all kinds of stuff that comes into play when, you're physically pushed to the limit. There is a mental aspect. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So we talked about VO2 max and lactate threshold. Are there any other similar fitness metrics that riders can or should pay attention to?
Fatigability and things like time to exhaustion, when your body, how long you can sustain high levels of output before you just explode is really important. We work with a lot of juniors too, and you'll have riders come in and say, I'm a sprinter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always, we get a chuckle out of that, because, okay, you may have a really, really high max power,
mm-hmm.
but can you produce that max power after 3 hours of racing?
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing to look at it. And
mm-hmm.
something that can be very easily trained is, can you, if you come in and your max power is 1500 watts, well, can you produce that at the end of 3 hours of bike racing? If not, and it's 900 watts, is that, does that keep you in the top tier? Are you still on the podium if you produce that much? So contextualizing some of these metrics is also really important. When does it matter?
Yeah.
You can throw down huge watts, but if you can't do it when the race is won, then, what does it really mean?
Right.
Efficiency factor is something we look at, and it's essentially, how efficiently are you riding for a given set of intervals? And it's typically used for more steady state stuff. So sweet spot, endurance riding, that's also, we talk about coaching marathon racers. It's very important that a marathon racer is a very efficient rider.
Mm.
They have good left-right balance with their pedaling. Heart rate decoupling is something we look at, which is, when does the rise in your heart rate decouple from your power output? When does it no longer reflect the power that you're putting out? So as you fatigue, that heart rate slowly climbs, and you might be producing the same or less power towards the end of an interval. And that's something we're looking at. And again, it's information that can lead to interval design and training plan design to increase fitness, increase adaptability to a certain type of event.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like these additional metrics, none of these are like a single number. I mean, I'm imagining like you have charts and graphs and it's like, X over Y and, time over metric and all kinds of stuff. But that is really cool to think about, how all that plays in, and then how does it tie to a race? Like you're saying, where, you're riding for 3 hours, but then what if you got a sprint at the end for the finish?
Exactly.
So yeah, not something that can be boiled down to a single number. So when we're talking about these training metrics, are there different ones that mountain bikers are going to focus in on compared to, say, road bikers?
No, they are pretty similar. Mountain bike racing, depending on the style of racing, tends to have higher variability in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, if you think about an XCO race, you're on the gas, on and off the gas constantly. It's not unlike a cyclocross race or even a really fast criterium. But if you're a marathon racer, your effort's going to be much more similar to like a long road stage. And then you get into something like downhill where it's just like, as hard as you can go for 3 to 5 minutes and that's it. So the metrics are pretty similar, but like certain types of mountain biking mirror certain types of road riding more readily than others. And those metrics we can use in very different ways to find successes and limiting factors, strengths and weaknesses. Something that we look at a lot as coaches is there's a feature in the software called a power duration model. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially a curve that shows where your power stacks up in the world, essentially. And the purpose of it is to suss out where are your strengths and weaknesses. So as a marathon mountain bike racer, I want to see a power curve that's more on the flat side, almost like a time trialist, because there's not a whole lot of head-to-head sprinting happening in a marathon mountain bike race.
Right.
There's kind of a whole shot. I mean, like people go pretty hard at the start, things separate out and you settle into the race. And, there might be a group of 1 or 2 at the finish and there might be a sprint, but for the most part, it's a pretty steady, hard effort. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you've watched a World Cup XCO race or a short track race and man, you got to be able to produce high levels of power over short duration over and over and over again. So that power curve looks different. And then you get into downhill where you want that sub 5 minute power numbers to be really high, almost like a BMX racer. Yeah. But they don't need to have great 30-minute, 1 hour, 3 hour power because they're never riding that. Right. That's you're going to train in those zones in the off season to build up your aerobic base, but that's not where a downhill race happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. So while we're on the topic of road versus mountain biking, there's an episode on your Endurance Collective podcast debating the merits of indoor versus outdoor training. And I know a lot of mountain bikers really scoff at the idea of training indoors. We'll ride outside whenever we can. But I'm curious, is it possible to get the same quality workout on the trail versus on the trainer, or even on the road versus on a trainer?
So one of the things I learned early on as a mountain bike racer was that I needed to get a road bike. And when I got my first coach, the first thing he did was convince me to buy a road bike because
oh man,
I know, right?
Nobody wants to hear that too.
I know.
Really?
And I've gone back to, and you start to see this with riders like Yolanda Neff as a somebody who rides her mountain bike on the road a lot. Mm-hmm. You need to spend time on consistent terrain to do aerobic intervals. Long, steady state intervals are really hard to do on single track, especially if it's real chunky stuff, because you start getting a lot of anaerobic contribution to your interval. The other part of it is resting, doing active recovery on a technical trail is next to impossible.
Right.
So you just can't do it. And so a road bike or a trainer is really good for that type of work. I think I rode the trainer 5 days this year. And out of those 5 days, 3 of those 5 days were a cross-country mountain bike on my trainer doing mountain bike Zwift.
Okay. That almost counts as mountain biking, but not quite. Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's video game mountain biking. I certainly don't enjoy it. I do have I coach a couple of racers who live in New England. And so in January, they are spending large amounts of time on the trainer building up that aerobic base. And they don't get as much opportunity to get outside when they can in the winter. I encourage them to, we'll reshuffle their training plan around because there's a dry day on the trails, and I want them to get some of that experience. But road bikes, mountain bikes with file tread tires are also a kind of a good substitute for a mountain bike. So second set of wheels with a road setup on it. Mm-hmm. Last year was the first year I really encouraged some of my more elite level riders to spend more time on their mountain bike than I have in the past. So doing some intervals that I traditionally would have had them do on a gravel bike or a road bike, having them do those on their mountain bike with road tires, just to really get familiar with the feel of their bike and the setup and everything, I think is really helpful. Mm-hmm. And you see that a lot now from the World Cup level riders as well.
Yeah. Well, I remember I did an interview with Chip from Wahoo Fitness, and he was saying, obviously his incentive is to sell a bunch of smart trainers, but he was saying that when their smart trainer first came out, it was the kind of thing where a few people in his riding group had them and some other folks didn't. And the people who had them ended up getting faster more quickly than the people who were just riding on the road and doing their training outdoors. Is that something you've seen with your athletes where there's things you can do on the smart trainer that maybe is even better than the road? Or if you say you lived in Florida, it's, you go out on the road, but it's flat all the time. So are there advantages to the trainer versus actually being outdoors?
You can be really precise on the trainer. It's sometimes much easier to do anaerobic threshold type intervals on the trainer, where you're doing short, hard sprints over and over and over again, and not having to worry about things like traffic,
right? Stoplights,
all that stuff. Certainly if you live in an urban area, trainers are very helpful. And like we said, cold climates or even hot climates. People who live in Arizona use the trainers in the summer, and that's kind of becomes their off season. But I encourage my riders to ride outside more often than not. I'm a big fan of training specificity. And for me, if every workout had some aspect of bike handling involved in it, I'm a happy guy. I mean, I know that's not always the reality, but especially with mountain bikers, the more you're riding your bike on variable terrain, the better.
Yeah.
You're not going to get a chance to do a couple of sweet spot intervals and then practice your drop skills on the Wahoo.
Right.
And it's, I don't want to, it is the smart trainer is a very valuable tool. And it certainly makes indoor training way less monotonous. But riding your bike on terrain is the gold standard.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned gravel riding, and that seems like an option now. So is that a good substitute, especially for mountain bikers who are like, no, I'm not getting a road bike. Can I just ride my gravel bike? Is that going to give me the same benefit?
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of the mountain bikers I coach just have a gravel bike. They have a road wheel set up for it, but they'll do a lot of their steady state endurance stuff on their gravel bike, or they have a hardtail that is their gravel bike. So, we have a couple of spots around here in Duke Forest is one spot, and Umstead Park where there's a ton of gravel, and it's a great place to get aerobic intervals and a long consistent aerobic ride done where you don't have to be on the road, and you can, enjoy time in the woods.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the bike handling too. I mean, I'm always shocked when I get on a gravel bike, and because you got no suspension, and you got the skinny tires, and it's like, you got to pick your lines and really pay attention.
You got to pick your lines, and, you can't just hit a rock or roll through a pothole at full speed. You pay a price for that.
Yeah.
And so, you kind of get a little bit of best of both worlds there. It's also a great, it's been a sport that's certainly grown a ton in the last few years, and I think at the detriment of road in a lot of ways. I've definitely seen more mountain bikers kind of come over to the gravel side of things for training, and a little bit of racing too. Mountain bikers who used to do some road races are spending more time on their gravel bike now.
Yeah. Interesting. So in another episode of your podcast, you talked about underfueling versus overfueling. And to me, this is a really fascinating topic because I feel like I get conflicting advice from my friends. I did a bikepacking trip earlier this year, and, obviously fueling is a big part of that, and have done some 100-miler mountain bike rides. So how do you know if you're getting the right balance of fuel on longer rides? Like, how do you know if you're under or over, or if you're just right?
Well, certainly if you're underfueled, you get that dead feeling in your legs. You feel hungry. You're, or dehydrated.
What about just before that though? Like, how do you know you're getting close?
Just before.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of dietitians here that we work with, and a lot of times what they'll do with some of our athletes is essentially plan that out to the gram of what they need based on some testing we'll do with them, sweat testing, where we determine how salty their sweat is, how much salt they need in their sports nutrition drink.
Yeah. Because everybody's different, I guess, is what you're saying.
Exactly. There's no one right answer here.
So that's why I get the conflicting advice, because I mean, literally somebody will say, I need a goo every 30 minutes. And somebody else is like, once an hour. Or,
There's everybody has, there's some general advice, I'm always shocked when I find out people don't eat, when they ride bikes, and, general rule, over an hour, you should probably be fueling. You need to be eating something, and if you live in a hotter climate, probably need to be using some form of sports drink mix. Gels, I tend to have people shy away from, because they spike your blood sugar so quickly, and then
they taste awful. So that's good advice.
And then you kind of crash on the backside of it. It's like drinking a Coke. You can drink your Coke to kind of shock yourself back to life, but then you got to back it up with some real food.
Right. I drink Mountain Dew, and it works well for me, but it's not for everybody.
Extreme, man.
Yes. Got to do the do.
So just having a general nutrition plan and following it is really good, and helpful. And, there are not a whole lot of for sure things in bike racing, but one thing that is for sure is if you don't fuel, you will not succeed. And then the over fueling aspect of it is, everybody's had that like kind of sloshy feeling in their gut. If you take on too much carbohydrate and your body cannot absorb that over the course of a certain amount of time, you're going to get that kind of sugar gut feeling, sloshing around in your intestines, because your intestinal walls literally can't uptake that carbohydrate into your body.
Right. So it's like a digestion thing. It's not like you have too much energy or whatever you want to call it, like in your bloodstream. It's just literally like your body can't process it.
Yeah. Your body can only process so many grams of carbohydrate an hour. And again, that's somewhat different for different people. And, that's something I'll leave up our experts to talk about, because I just kind of nod my head and, know the general rules, but, there's some, it's pretty low tech ways to figure it out. And we were talking about VO2 max earlier, figuring out your fueling and how many grams of carbohydrate you can take on an hour and what kind of sports drink works for you, that will benefit you so much more in the short term and with relation to your performance than getting a VO2 max test.
Wow.
You know, if you have a really good fueling plan and you know what fuel works best for you, you're going to be shocked at how successful you'll be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that part of the advice that I hear from people does fit. A lot of people say you need to figure out what works for you. You need to try, like, during your training rides, like eating different foods and seeing how you do. Like, how do you fuel? I mean, one of the things a lot of people like to talk about is like real food versus, like, you know, these sports energy drinks or bars or whatever. Do you have an opinion on that, or what have you found works for you? Again, just for you. That's not for like everybody. But
I like to eat as much real food as I can when I ride. I do on longer rides. I'll fuel with a carbohydrate drink mix. So Scratch Super Fuel is what I use primarily.
Okay.
And I like their hydration drink mixes as well, just because they don't have a whole lot of junk in them, and not a lot of color. And, you know, I try to be as minimalist as possible with that.
Yeah.
But, you know, I like what is lipid enhanced recovery wafers or potato chips.
I was like writing this down. I need to get some of those on Amazon. Yeah.
No, you know, I like to have savory things too, because, you know, you're having so much sugary stuff. We had one of our dietitians ran a 50-mile ultra marathon last weekend, and, you know, she was crushing some pickles and potato chips and, you know, all kinds of salty stuff because she's drinking sugar drink the whole time. So it's good to kind of shake it up a little bit. You know, when I was in Europe, I ate a lot of little finger sandwiches and like the Scratch Feed Zone cookbook type rice bars made out of sticky rice and like bacon and eggs and stuff.
Oh, wow.
Some of the stuff can be really delicious.
Yeah.
You know, I have to like shoo my wife out of the refrigerator because she's eating my my riding nutrition stuff because it tastes good. And that's a good sign when you find stuff like that.
Yeah, like athletes only. I tell my kids that with the like Cliff bars, they want to just like eat, sit on the couch and eat one. I'm like, no, you gotta exercise. You gotta earn that.
Yeah. And, you know, I remember the days when I'd ride with the old style power bar and, you know, it was like 20 degrees out and you had to have it inside your base layer. So it would be warm enough that you could actually chew it. Those days are over, man.
Yeah. Even then, man, you like break your teeth on those. Yeah. Those are awful.
I know.
Yeah. So that's great advice. And it's cool that people are coming around to that idea of like eating real foods and it took me a while to figure out the salty thing as well, where, you know, it's like every prepackaged nutrition, sports nutrition thing you buy is sweet. I mean, it's like 95% of it is just sweet. And yeah, you need that salt. And eventually, you figure that out.
Both, you know, there's a psychological aspect to it too, man. It crushes your soul if you're doing a 4-hour race and you're just eating candy the whole time. And, you know, it'd be nice to have, you know, something salty. I almost like crush a piece of pizza.
Yeah, pizza. Yeah, I have friends that go bring a slice of pizza on a long ride, and yeah, I'm always jealous. That's definitely the way to go. Well, Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. I learned a ton, and always such a great source of advice and information. So thanks.
Yeah, dude, I appreciate the invite, and look forward to guesting sometime else too.
Yeah. You can find the YouTube podcast for the Endurance Collective online, and the website is theendurancecollective.com. And we'll have links to both of those in the show notes. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.